Something that I see come up quite frequently with people who are studying philosophy, and not just among complete beginners, but I have colleagues that are bedeviled by this as well, is a sort of preoccupation with the contradictions or inconsistencies of the philosophers that they're studying, and being too worried about that. And along with that is sort of a flip side that we're going to explore. Where does this come from, this drive to have, perfectly articulated philosophical systems or doctrines that don't exist in real life and certainly don't exist in our heads or the lives of people who do philosophy? Not to say that, anything goes or contradiction is always a-okay or to be expected, or to invoke that I contain multitudes, right? We don't want to go that far, but we also want to think a bit about why people get so upset and invested and worried and concerned about something that perhaps doesn't merit that level of response. And so I've got some thoughts on this that might be helpful for you. And, they're all kind of jumbled together, which maybe fits this quite well, because I'm willing to say that most philosophers are not these weird alien beings, totally unlike the rest of us, who somehow have perfectly logical minds that, are put together almost like, computer programs, or laid out like charts or anything like that. That's just not the way that it works. And so that's a good place to start with. I think that a lot of people have gotten mistaken ideas about what philosophers are like and what we should expect of them. And so, there are quite a few people that maybe it's a sort of hero worship, or it's the way that stories are told about philosophers in introductory classes and, great courses, videos, and popularizations and secondary sources and all that sort of stuff. But we think of them as like these people who are way, way up here. They're like all brain, and, they might have a life, but their life is somewhat secondary to what it is that they're doing. And, what really matters is that they worked out a whole bunch of ideas and perhaps engaged with previous philosophers in doing so, or their contemporaries, and then they left behind this great legacy, which is usually a bunch of books, right? And the idea here is that, unlike the rest of us, messy human beings, these philosophers, whatever we want to call them, they should be free of any glaring contradictions or inconsistencies or even tensions, maybe even unclarities within their work, ambiguities, we might say. And that's a very unrealistic point of view, but I think a lot of people actually do have this, and because they have it and then they encounter reading philosophical texts that this isn't the case, it really throws them for a loop. And it could be in terms of just studying somebody's text and saying, well, I don't get it. Aristotle's saying this here, but he's also saying this over here, and these things don't actually map onto each other. Well, for example, a lot of people want to make a big deal out of Aristotle saying, well, there's something like a unity of the virtues. He never uses that term, by the way. That's just popularizers and secondary lit people later on wanting to talk about the thesis of the unity of the virtues, or the question of the unity of the virtues. That's not Aristotle himself. But if you read through Aristotle's works, you'll find plenty of occasions where he talks about somebody having this virtue but not having this one, right? And you're like, what's going on there? I don't understand. Or, happiness in the Nicomachean Ethics is going to be the active life, but then in Book 10, now it's the contemplative life. Oh my gosh, how can he be contradicting himself? And people do this in terms of a philosopher's life as well. Look at Seneca. He's preaching Stoicism, but he's a rich man, and he has, slaves, and he's working with Nero. How can this be? People get really worked up about these sorts of things. So, maybe this derives from sources like not actually knowing enough about the philosopher, and not knowing enough, we could say, firsthand by reading their actual works. If you want to know what René Descartes actually thinks about stuff, well, you've got to read the Discourse and the Meditations, and it certainly couldn't hurt to read some of his letters or some of the other works like the Principles of Philosophy, rather than just reading what other people tell you that René Descartes said, thought, taught, right? Because sometimes those people have an axe to grind, or they're wrong, or they were careless readers. And so when we rely too much on, let's call it the whole realm of secondary takes, people telling us what it is that they think a philosopher was all about, what their doctrines were, what it was that they said, then we can run into trouble. And I relied on that myself. As a student, I didn't know any better. I would, read summaries of people, and then when I read them later on, I was like, well, this is kind of weird. This is not what I actually thought this person was all about. And it can be, kind of liberating. So that could be quite helpful. And I think that there's also an investment. People want certainty that they're not finding in their ordinary life. And they look to philosophy and philosophers for that. And you can find some there, perhaps, but not as much as our hopes and dreams and ideals are reaching out and imposing on these people and their thoughts and their work. And we could think of philosophy itself, this is a generalization, philosophy in a very broad sense, as an attempt to not simply bring down order and perfect consistency and lack of contradiction from the heavens, but to do the painstaking work of trying to slowly, laboriously, cumulatively, and not just with pure progress, but setbacks, to bring that into reality as best as we can in an approximative way, not a perfect way. To bring a bit more order, to bring a bit more thinking things through, and doing so sometimes in our life and in our thought, sometimes not so much in our life and just in our thought. And we do so over time, You think about the great books of philosophy. They weren't written in a day. It's not like Plato simply sat down and out came the Republic, right? Or Aristotle sat down and here comes the Nicomachean Ethics or the Metaphysics or, Descartes' Meditations or Kant's, any of his critiques or Hegel's Phenomenology, pick whatever else you want. These are a lot of work, and they go through, thinking things through and adding things and subtracting things in an editorial process. So that's something you probably want to keep in mind. And I think that sometimes the seeming contradictions, they might not actually be contradictions as such, the way that we feel that they are. It's actually us imposing a situation on the texts and the thinker that create contradictions. For example, taking passages out of context. So, if you're going to say, well, so-and-so says this here, but what about this over here? That little portion, you might want to see what's happening in the whole paragraph that's a part of. Sometimes people will actually get things wrong because they take just one portion of a large sentence and they're like, this is what this person is saying, and they forget about all the provisos, they forget about the qualifiers, they forget about all of the things that place it in a more limited context. So that's really important. Sometimes we actually just get things wrong. We misread, and we're like, so-and-so thinks this. And then somebody's like, where are you getting that from? It says it right here. And then you look at it again, and you're like, ooh, no, it doesn't say that. It actually says something quite different. And again, that's happened to me, And that's not only happened to me as a student, that's happened to me over the course of my career. Sometimes I actually have to go back and I'm like, oh, I messed this up. I misread. And if that's going to happen to me, it can happen to, other people who do philosophy full time, and it can happen to all of us, right? And why? Because we're human. Sometimes it's a problem of not having read enough within the philosophers' works, and we think that their definitive statements are right here. This happens, I'll use Aristotle again as an example. People read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and they're like, now I know everything about what Aristotle thinks about ethics. So when it comes to certain things like, deliberative or moral choice, proiresis, well, I've read Nicomachean Ethics, book 3. I know everything there is to know about his position. Well, he mentions it in book 6, and that changes things a bit. And he mentions it in book 7, and he also mentions it in the Eudemian Ethics in different ways, and he also mentions it in the Rhetoric, and he also mentions it in the Poetics. So if you're not reading these other books, you might be missing some really important parts of the puzzle or the picture that allow you to, again, bring proper contextualization to things. Relying on secondary takes, I've already talked about this. It's easy to get suckered by thinking that, listen, this person is a scholar on this person, or they're a big name philosopher themselves. They must have gotten it right. You don't really know whether they've got it right or not until you go and look at what it is that they're providing you, their summary, their interpretation, their polemical take on. And this applies all over the place. Somebody who's really lovely in pointing out contradictions, you could say that he made a method and career out of it. Jacques Derrida. Did he actually get Rousseau correct? Is he right about de Saussure? Is he right about Husserl? Is he right in his criticisms of this person and that person? Is he halfway right? Well, don't take his word for it. You got to go and actually check it out. And oftentimes when you do, you find, they did get it right. And sometimes you find out, no, they actually got it wrong. There's some where it's really easy. There's no way that Hegel could be as much of a charlatan as Arthur Schopenhauer makes him out to be in his work. So that probably is off base, right? But you got to go and read Hegel, and you got to see what Schopenhauer says about him to actually compare these. Another way people often get themselves in all sorts of trouble is assuming that philosophers are going to be completely careful and consistent in their use of language. Now, philosophers often are attentive to language and will point out, important distinctions. This means this in this context. This means this in this context. But they're not perfect. And oftentimes we have to bring our own critical capacities and our ability to say, I bet that the word is not being used in the exact same way in this passage that would allow me to cookie cutter, lift it out, and then make a deductive argument about what's being said over here, and then find a contradiction. We got to be careful. We got to think about what terms actually mean, and sometimes that requires context as well. And I think another thing that we sometimes screw ourselves up in is expecting the same level of rigor and precision from different genres of writing or presentation. If somebody is talking to a popular audience in a talk, that's given and you find it in a video, maybe that's not the same thing as writing a treatise that you've spent 10 years on and you've gone through multiple editions of. Letters, maybe not exactly the same level of, this is my definitive take on this, as writing a treatise. So you got to be, kind of attentive to that as well. And realize that sometimes we don't actually know what the genre is. Again, to take Aristotle, people will, assert, we know that these are lecture notes from his students. We don't know anything of the sort. We have scholars who, speculate that that's what the Nicomachean Ethics is, but we don't really know. So, we have to be kind of careful, provisional in the declarations that we make about stuff and the inferences that we draw. Another thing to keep in mind, sometimes philosophers are going to have, changes in their point of view from one text to another. And with philosophers who are fairly recent, where we know when they were published, that's a bit easier to track. It's a little bit harder when we go back to earlier philosophers where we don't have that sort of ordering through time, and we're not sure when one text was published or disseminated or worked on and when another one was. We only have theories about that sort of stuff. But, philosophers will change their mind over time. Why? Because they're reasonable people. If they actually, think that their perspective needs to change, they will change it. It's not going to be changing overnight, but, that may be a source of certain inconsistencies where you're like, so-and-so said this back in their 20s, and then they said this in their 50s. Well, maybe their views changed. That's one possibility, isn't it? And you could say, well, then they have a duty to let us know. Well, who tells you that they've got that duty? Is that your assumption that you're making there? That they should have made it easy for you to figure out the exact chronology of their ideas? I think that's a little unrealistic. And then we can say this. Well, what if philosophers, even if we put all this other stuff aside, what if they turn out to be inconsistent? Well, who cares? They're human beings, like you and me. And do you expect them to be gods? And not like Greek gods, who themselves are pretty inconsistent, right? Zeus doesn't like anyone screwing Hera, but he screws around on her. That's an inconsistency. Perfect gods? That's not us. That's not reality of human nature. Why should it surprise us that there are going to be some inconsistencies in these people who we label as philosophers or historians or anybody else working in the humanities? They're dealing with complex realities and trying to do a decent enough job in thinking deeply and consistently about that. And they're going to screw up from time to time. It doesn't take away their achievements. I think we want to put aside this tendency to play gotcha and say, aha, if there's any inconsistency, any contradiction, we throw it all away. That's not a good way to do philosophy. And a lot of people have kind of hamstrung their philosophical development and work that way. So, don't demand or impose or expect perfection. And you should think about what your own motivations are, why it's so important to you that these philosophers not have any contradictions or inconsistencies. Where's that coming from? Because that's not necessary. You can read philosophy and see, oh yeah, there's some problems here in Aristotle's work. I guess we have to decide whether we're going to go this way or this way. You can be perfectly happy and sanguine about it. You could even approach that as a cool problem or issue that's worth celebrating and talking about. It doesn't have to be doom and gloom and dark clouds and throwing you into a depression because there's some sort of inconsistency. And it doesn't have to be throw away the book or anything like that. We should almost expect, if we're being realistic about things, that there will be inconsistencies. And so think about your own motivations. Where is that coming from? Are you making wrong inferences from bad examples that have come to you from the hero-worshipping professor that you had who talked about how great Kant was, or Hegel, or Nietzsche, or pick whoever else you want, and they're like some sort of super genius. Why would you follow that person's wrong-headed ideas about these thinkers, whether they're past thinkers or contemporary thinkers? I mean, the good thing with contemporary thinkers is unless they're really full of themselves, you can actually ask them, do you know everything? Are you perfectly consistent? And most often they'll say, whoa, no, I'm not, right? But past thinkers, we tend to have this kind of, we give an aura to them of we expect infallibility of sorts, and then we're really disappointed. And another thing that goes along with that, you don't necessarily have to like or appreciate any particular philosopher. I actually agree quite a bit with people like William James, who think that what he calls our volitional or passional life plays a big role in our intellectual pursuits. And so, you may be more attuned to certain thinkers than to others, and you want there to be consistency in them. You don't really care about these others over here. That's fine, but, look at them as best like friends, not as, robots or computers, as if those actually are completely free of contradiction as well. And then the last thing I'm going to bring up here, should you adopt what they used to call the principle of charity, or a charitable interpretation of everybody? So if there are inconsistencies that you find or contradictions, and they are genuine, it's not just you importing it or imposing it, do you have to try to find the most charitable take? What a lot of people these days, because they love new terms and it makes them sound cool, call steel manning, right? As opposed to straw manning. Do you have a duty to do that? I don't think you do. And as a matter of fact, I actually would say not only do you not have a duty to do that with inconsistent and contradictory thinkers and philosophers, but you should also apply the same thing. Why do you think that you have that? Did somebody on the outside tell you that's the way to do philosophy, and you have some sort of obligation to do it? Was it a teacher? Was it a book? Was it a forum online? Was it somebody in Reddit who told you that's the way to do it? You don't have to buy into their stuff either. You have freedom to do philosophy and to study philosophy in the way that you want to. I mean, there are criteria. Is this actually working for you? Are you making progress? Are you more or less getting the thinkers right? So you're not, complaining about stuff that they supposedly did and they didn't do, or, criticizing them for stuff, or hero worshiping them as being much better than they were. You can do things the way that you want to. You just see whether it's actually working out, and you talk with other people to help yourself figure out that you're not off base, let alone crazy in your interpretations of things. So you don't have to extend perfect charity. You don't have an obligation to do that to thinkers and say, oh, if there's a contradiction, it's probably not a contradiction. Sometimes there are contradictions, but that doesn't have to throw you for a loop. And after a while, you can adopt a more, what would we call it? More realistic, I've said, but also when it comes to emotions, a more tranquil approach to that. You can be like, oh, look at that. That's interesting. Kant thinks he's being consistent here, but he isn't. What's going on with that? Or Mary Wollstonecraft, one of my favorite thinkers, has all this interesting stuff to say about marriage and love and friendship. Did she practice that in her own life? Well, not with complete consistency, right? And what can we learn from this? Sometimes contradictions or inconsistencies aren't something that mean we have to stop here. We can actually open them up and say, what else can we learn from this? Maybe the philosopher themselves doesn't have much to teach us at that point, but that's where we can actually do some interesting and productive work on our own part.